Thanks everyone to join our monthly seminar series today. Dr. Rosanna will give a talk on the reconsidering safety and efficacy of medical cannabis. Dr. Rosanna actually have a very broad research interest, and he's known for the intracellular PK or intracellular drug disposition. In his research, he created this one-cell PK to study the drug distribution, disposition inside of the organelle. I think that's important for many drugs in terms of efficacy, toxicity, all of those. But in the last few years, I would say maybe in the last 10 years, Dr. Rosanna really have a lot of thought, thinking about a medicinal cannabis. So today he will give a very different talk and talk about this popular herbal medicine. Seems is the topic in the street everybody talk about, then some people using, and then I think Dr. Rosanna will focus on how to think about the safety, efficacy, and also the rescheduling the research for this area. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Rosanna to give a talk today. Gus is yours.
Thank you very much, Dushin. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you all the people who came today to this presentation. So I'm going to talk about the most recent developments in terms of regulating medicinal cannabis in the United States, which basically involves rescheduling it from Schedule 1, which means there is no acceptable medical use, to Schedule 3, which means that medical use of cannabis is accepted. As a background, cannabis extract was widely available and used in pharmacies in the United States before 1937. For commercial reasons, not medical reasons, cannabis commerce was prohibited in 1937 because of the Marijuana Tax Act, basically prohibited the purchase and sale of cannabis. But it could still be used as medicine, and it was still legal. Nevertheless, in 1971, the Controlled Substances Act prohibited cannabis because it defined medical use based on very strict criteria that was supposed to be enforced by the DEA. These strict criteria started with the drug's chemistry being precisely known and reproducible. There being adequate safety studies to back the medical use of the purported drug. Then there was supposed to be adequate and well-controlled studies to establish drug efficacy. It was supposed to be accepted by qualified experts, and the scientific evidence must be made widely available. Under these strict criteria, cannabis which is a plant, was left out, but it made possible the development of single chemical entities that were produced by the pharmaceutical industry as synthetic medical products. Now, 50 years later, in 2024, we have around 50 current cell and gene therapies that are approved by the FDA, yet they don't conform to the strict criteria that were used back in 1971 to establish approved medical use. So if you look at T cells, for example, these CAR T cell therapies, there is no mass spectra associated with them. There is no NMR spectra. There's no crystal structure. There's no precise size. There's no molecular mass. There's no defined composition. In fact, these cells are often made so they're genetically engineered to the patient's cancer. As a result, there's no chemical identity whatsoever. So based on the strict criteria that people used to use in 1971 to define what was a drug, these modern technologies, modern therapies that are now FDA approved should actually be illegal. And this has actually led to a transformation in the way that we think about what constitutes a drug and what should be legal and illegal. But if you look at the other criteria and you think about the establishment of safety and efficacy and whether or not there's an approved medical use, there was a study, this is a whole textbook that was put together in 2017 by the National Academies of Sciences, called The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, State of Evidence and Recommendation for Research, which basically defined the state of medical knowledge surrounding the plant in 2017. So that's a little bit less than 10 years ago. In this book, basically, there is a list of conclusions. There's around 25 different conclusions, but I'm going to mention the key ones. And number one, it's very clearly stated, this is a panel of experts convened by the National Academy of Sciences, many of them National Academy of Sciences members who evaluated thousands of publications. And they say there's conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis and cannabinoids are effective for the treatment of chronic pain in adults, also as antiemetics in the treatment of chemotherapy, nausea and vomiting, and for improving patient-reported multiple sclerosis symptoms. So this is what the experts say. They also say there's moderate evidence for cannabis or cannabinoids being effective at improving short-term sleep outcomes in individuals with sleep disturbances associated with obstructive sleep apnea, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. And then they pointed to limited evidence that cannabis and cannabinoids are effective for increasing appetite and decreasing body weight loss associated with cachexia and HIV and AIDS patients, improving clinician-measured multiple sclerosis symptoms, improving symptoms of Tourette syndrome, improving anxiety symptoms, and improving symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Finally, perhaps more importantly, in regards to the toxicity, these experts declared that there was no sufficient evidence or insufficient evidence to support or refuse any association between cannabis use and all-cause mortality, so it's not leading to greater incidence of death, occupational accidents or injuries, or death due to cannabis overdose. Basically, defining cannabis as an effective and safe medication. So we enter this past year, and August 2023, the FDA is put in charge of reassessing all the evidence and declaring or defining whether or not the legal status of cannabis should be changed. FDA goes and puts together several different panels and basically comes up with a document that is then sent to the HHS, which is basically the office in the federal government that manages the FDA, the NIH, the CDC, the EPA, and Medicare, puts together this document, considerations for whether marijuana has a currently accepted medical use in the United States for the purpose of the Controlled Substances Act. And as a result of this document, the current Assistant Secretary of the HHS, who is also an admiral, so this is the highest ranking officer of the US Navy, sends a letter to the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency Administrator, declaring, pursuant to the Controlled Substances Act and the uh, the Assistant Secretary for Health is recommending that marijuana, referring to botanical cannabis, this is the plant that is within the definition of marijuana or marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act, be in Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. So basically, the evidence was reviewed by the FDA. The National Institute of Drug Abuse then reviewed and agreed with the enclosed documents, which is a more than 100 pages worth of discussion, and ultimately recommended for the HHS head to send this letter to the DEA to declare cannabis as an effective and safe medication that should be rescheduled to Schedule 3. So what is the evidence that led to this change? So basically, the evidence comes largely from studies that have been done with Marinol, which is an FDA-approved prescription drug that has as an active ingredient dronabinol. And what a lot of people don't realize is that dronabinol is actually delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the active ingredient that's psychoactive in the cannabis plant. Marinol with delta 9 THC as active ingredient is indicated for the treatment of nausea and vomiting in cancer patients, and is indicated for the treatment of cachexia in AIDS patients. This active ingredient is the synthetic version, chemically synthetic version of delta 9 THC. It's chemically identical to the active component, primary active component that's psychoactive in the cannabis plant. And basically, because of the efficacy and the safety of this drug, there is every reason to classify cannabis, which contains delta 9 THC as one of its ingredients, as a safe and efficacious medication for treating nausea, vomiting, and cachexia. Now, Marinol comes in a well-defined dosage form. So these are gel caps. The active ingredient, THC or dronabinol, is formulated in sesame oil, which is then packaged inside these little pills in well-defined doses. So this is how the FDA has been used to basically defining the dosage forms that are acceptable for patient use. This drug has been extensively tested in phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials, placebo control. There's pharmacokinetics associated with it. Basically, it's an oral dosage form, and depending on the dose, whether it's 2.55 or 10 milligrams, you have blood concentrations that rise after the drug is taken orally and then fall off. Worth noting is the big standard deviations, and that has been a major problem with this particular medication, which is why people end up preferring to smoke cannabis or ingest cannabis relative to taking the doctor prescribed Marinol. It's got side effects, as everybody knows. There's a long list of side effects. There is obviously the mental CNS side effects: dizziness, drowsiness, confusion, lightheadedness. There can be nausea, vomiting, and palpitations, all kinds of different side effects, as is normal to any drug. But more importantly, the plant itself has been available since the 1930s. It's never really left the United States, and it's been grown by people, by Americans who can then smoke it in the form of a joint, and oftentimes they prefer to smoke it than to take the pill. And the reason why people prefer to smoke it relative to taking the pill is because they can actually, and it's been shown pharmacokinetically, that they can actually control, very carefully titrate how much THC they're ingesting with every breath they take. So this is an experiment that was done by Marilyn Westes, who is now she's at the university. I think she's in Temple right now. She used to be at the National Institute of Drug Abuse. But basically, she was the one person in the federal government, the only one person who was allowed to do this kind of experiments back in the 1990s. And she did an experiment where she asked patients to smoke cannabis, and as they were smoking it, she would be taking blood samples. What she observed was that every time a patient would take a breath, so if you look at the first 15 minutes, so the time here is in hours, during the first 15 minutes, the patients are being asked to smoke every 10 seconds, then puff out the smoke for 15 seconds, and then take another puff every other 10 seconds. And what you see is that as they're smoking, the THC levels in the blood are progressively increasing. So basically, this allows the patients to carefully titrate out their THC needs as they're smoking. The other point that she noticed was that the amounts of THC leading to concentrations in the blood were vastly exceeding the amounts that would be experienced by the patients when they were taking the oral formulation. So in the oral formulations, basically you get up to a Cmax, so maximum concentration of 4 nanograms per milliliter, whereas if patients were smoking it, you could exceed that amount 10 to 20 times greater. So 40, 50, 100, 140 nanograms per milliliter. So as patients would be smoking, they would be exceeding the amounts that they would normally be experiencing from the FDA approved formulation. But these concentrations would drop very rapidly over the first hour to levels that would be comparable to the levels that they were getting in the dronabinol or marinol pill. So because of smoking, people would prefer, because they're able to better control the dose and the effects with smoking, people would prefer to smoke relative to taking the THC marinol pill. Now, over the past 10 years, there has been an opioid epidemic. And as a result of the opioid epidemic, people actually have been looking for alternatives to opioids that they can use to relieve their chronic pain without risking themselves the lethal side effects of opioids. And what this has resulted in is, in the case of states that have medically approved cannabis program, the number of patients between 2016 and 2020 rose from 500,000 patients, which are registered as qualified pain patients taking cannabis, all the way up to over 1 million patients in 2020 using cannabis in medically qualified state program to treat chronic pain, PTSD, arthritis, and cancer. Now, these are patients that have doctor prescriptions for pain medicine, could be opioids, that decide to turn these opioid prescriptions into medical cannabis recommendations, which they can do through state laws that will then allow them to access medical cannabis within the states. And what this shows is basically there is a preference for the medical cannabis over other doctor prescribed medications from the patients. And these cannabis in state programs are not regulated at the federal level. Basically, they're subject to state level regulations, but not federal regulations, because at the federal level, the medicinal cannabis, the plant-based derived botanical medicines, remain illegal. Now, in 2018, a second medication derived from cannabis was approved by the FDA. This medication is Epidiolex. Epidiolex is cannabidiol, which is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid component. And unlike dronabinol, which is a synthetic version of THC, Epidiolex is made from cannabis-derived cannabidiol. So this is actually a plant-derived natural substance that's extracted from the plant and is then isolated and crystallized and dissolved in pure form in sesame oil and is then given to patients. So Epidiolex was FDA approved after a phase 3 placebo-controlled clinical trial. Its main active ingredient is directly derived from a component of the cannabis plant. It is indicated for epilepsy and tremor. In addition, it has anti-inflammatory, anticonvulsive, and sedating effects. It's crystallized from extracts obtained from the plant and is highly lipophilic. And I will get to that later on in terms of why that's important. So Epidiolex is used to treat a very severe form of epilepsy that primarily affects children. So typically these children get between 300 and 600 seizures a day. They're practically in a seizure, and they are unable to eat without proper treatment. Typically, other forms of treatment fail, but Epidiolex CBD has been found to be effective. It allows the children to eat, it allows the children to survive, and ultimately these children that would have otherwise died are able to grow, because this particular form of epilepsy will naturally will naturally cure itself as long as the kids are able to eat. So eventually the kids are able to eat and they outgrow the disease. So the drug itself was shown to be effective at treating this very serious form of epilepsy. Epidiolex has side effects like any other drug, somnolence being the primary side effect. There's decreased appetite, there's diarrhea, but patients can't self-titrate. They can control how much drug they're getting, and by adjusting the amount of drug they're getting to their side effects and the efficacy, they can basically arrive at an ideal dose that allows them to survive and while avoiding negative side effects. Again, because cannabis doesn't have any effect on mortality, it's non-lethal, it's okay for patients to self-titrate. They're not risking any lethality, unlike many other prescription drugs. Now, if you go to a dispensary, you will find that CBD and many of these cannabis products are formulated as foods. So they're either sold as cookies or brownies, or they're put in drinks when they're edibles, or gummies, even ingredients for making pizza. So how about these formulations? Are they any good? We carried out a review and this is a meta-analysis of published studies that had been done with CBD, both primarily in Epidiolex, but we also looked outside of Epidiolex, looking at all formulations that have been orally dosed involving administration of CBD in rigorous clinical studies. What we did was we primarily looked for Epidiolex, but we also looked at other CBD formulations. And then we normalized clinical trials based on patient weight and we normalized them based on the dose that the patients were given. So basically, this allowed us to pull all the data together. And when there was information about whether the patients had taken the drug either in fasted state or in a fed state, which many times is well defined by FDA standards, we were able to compare both the area under the curve, the Cmax, so the maximum blood concentration at the time at which the Cmax was obtained, so the Tmax. And what we found was that in fed patients, CBD had much greater bioavailability than in fasted patients, but more importantly, administration in the fed state would lead to much lower inter-individual variability and much more predictable pharmacokinetics. The other thing we found was that in patients who were taking the CBD in a fasted state, so without any food, the amount of sesame oil that was included as part of the dose was this likely main contributor to the dose-dependent variations in CBD pharmacokinetics. Basically, this study is building on the work of Professor Amidon, who is Professor Emeritus at the College of Pharmacy. And what Professor Amidon and other people demonstrated was that during the fed state, the gastrointestinal motility slows down in order for the stomach to be able to better absorb, and the intestine to be able to better absorb the amount of drug that you would be administering them. So this mechanism, the slowing down of gastrointestinal motility, explains the greater bioavailability, but it also explains the decrease in the error that you get in the pharmacokinetics when patients are being given this drug, which is normally formulated in sesame oil in amounts that are sufficient to alter in it of itself the gastrointestinal motility mechanics. So we recommended that Epidiolex should be preferentially administered with food, which is consistent with the fact that most patients will prefer cannabis edibles in the form not as a pure pill or capsule, but they will actually prefer it in the form of a brownie or a drink or a gummy or some kind of food that will actually promote a better pharmacokinetic profile. So in May of this year, the Department of Justice, which oversees both the DEA and the HAC, concurred with the HHS and said that perhaps the 5-part test that the DEA was using to define current acceptable medical use, CAMU, was too strict, and that perhaps there was a need of a much more broader kind of criteria for review. So it suggested that DEA should proceed with rescheduling as recommended by the HHS, and basically agreed with the recommendations from the FDA and NIDA that cannabis should be reconsidered as a medically useful drug. So the revised criteria for current approved medical use is that were recommended by the HHS and then were agreed upon by the Office of the Counsel of the Department of Justice is, number one, whether there exists widespread current experience with medical use of the substance by licensed healthcare providers operating in accordance with implemented jurisdiction authorized program where medical use is recognized by entities that regulates the practice of medicine, and if so, whether there exists some credible scientific support for at least one of the medical conditions for which this is satisfied, both of which are true for medical cannabis. So coming to this talk, the question is, should we still, as an academic institution, make believe that we're still in 1971, where the drug's chemistry must be known and reproducible, and basically dismiss the fact that the FDA has approved over 50 high-tech therapies where the chemistry of these therapies are absolutely unknown? Or perhaps we should proceed and adopt, in the way we educate our students, the revised criteria for currently accepted medical use, which is whether there exists a widespread current experience with the medical use of this substance. Now, in regards to whether we should accept the HHS revised criteria for medical use, I would like to point out that this accepted medical use is not restricted to the United States. And this is something, as somebody who was born and raised in Colombia, in South America, this is something that I take very seriously, because I was exposed to completely different regulations and completely different types of products as I was growing up, from the medicines that we see here in the pharmacies in the United States. So I decided to go to Santa Marta, Colombia, and to put this in perspective, so here's Michigan on top, Miami, Florida is a 3-hour plane ride. Santa Marta is in the northern Caribbean coast of Colombia. And what makes Santa Marta particularly interesting is the fact that this is basically ground zero for all these medicinal cannabis legalization initiatives. So cannabis used to be grown primarily in the mountains that are right behind where the city of Santa Marta is. There's the city itself is on the tropic. It's warm, very hot all year round, but there is a mountain right behind the city that shoots straight up. It's the closest snowy peak in the equatorial region to the earth. Within 50 miles, you can go from 100-degree weather, like the climate in Miami, Florida, all the way up to snow-covered mountains. And as you go up the mountain, you will find every single possible crop that can grow in every single possible climate in the world, including cannabis and coca and many other natural herbs that have been used by the indigenous people of the world as medicine since the beginning of time. In this mountain, there are actually 4 tribes, 4 Native American tribes that have escaped extermination by European colonizers since they arrived in America in 1492 with Christopher Columbus. The city was founded in 1525. It's going to be 500 years old. So it's actually the oldest city in the American continent, and is the epicenter for where a lot of these herbal medicines that are now being considered as legal, where they all began. So I'm gonna show you some of the images that I took. So this is the city as you look at the city from the ocean. Behind the city, where you see the clouds, it's the mountain. This is more than 5,000 meters, so it's within 50 miles of the city. You just shoot straight up. You can have, there are beaches with a lot of tourist attractions and hotels. The city itself is 500 years old, so you can actually see the very old constructions from the times the Spanish were in Colombia, but you can also see more modern kinds of edifications from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. If you go around the city, you will go into fishermen's villages. So there's all these really nice villages. And if you go up the mountain, basically you are going into rainforest. Now you can, in the city, you can eat fresh seafood. So you can buy a a soup that you would pay here $30. You can buy this soup in street food for like $1. But what's more important is that you will see these native indigenous people that are otherwise dressed as normal people. You will see them selling their medicinal substances. So in this case, this gentleman is selling this particular substance. So it's called sanagua. It says medicinal fruit is supposed to uh, eliminate inflammation of the colon, of the prostate. It's supposed to clean the uterus, eliminate renal stones. It helps lower cholesterol, triglycerides. I don't know if any of this is true. So this is a pharmacy. So this is medicine that's used to treat pain, and basically it's a combination of, so it's the one here on the right, coca, marijuana, and arnica. So it's a combination of coca leaves, marijuana leaves, and arnica, which is another plant. So it's extracted. These are all rubs. It's not ingested orally. The one on the left is a different kind of natural medicine. This is for treating skin diseases. But the one on the right is supposed to treat all kinds of pain: migraine, headache, muscular pain, uh, foot pain, inflammation pain, varices, bone pain, everything. So now this is a bakery from one of the local bakers in the city. These breads, they're actually medicinal breads. So the color that you see outside, so it's based on having being made, the crust is made out of beets, is made out of curcumin, is the dark ones is cocoa. There's also breads that incorporates spinach. So this is all part of the tradition, of the natural medicine tradition that is in this city. The baker herself is a combined, she's a part Portuguese, part Native American, and part African American. And this is a cross section of one of these breads. And this is me at the university. So there is a medical school, there's a dental, a college of pharmacy. So these are state public universities. So I'm with the students here, and I'm giving a talk about demystifying the use of medicinal cannabis and dealing with their secondary side effects. So this is part of a presentation that I gave at this university last year, where I was speaking with the faculty members in terms of how the regulations have changed in a manner that can potentially allow for these other different kinds of medications that wouldn't be considered medications by the FDA, but are now potentially being considered as medications if there were clinical trials made to support their clinical usefulness. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. My email is given here, my Instagram. You can look me up in Google. I would like to acknowledge NIH grants that funded some of this research, and also I would like to acknowledge support by Kairos Research Foundation. Kairos Research Foundation organized a 5K race in Detroit, and basically all the funds that were donated by the runners went straight to support my cannabis research project. Whatever that the NIH wouldn't allow, the private funders from people who were running this race was used to support the the research. So with that, I would like to basically thank you all for being here and open the room for questions. I don't know if we're allowed to comment verbally or we have a chat.
Yes, we have a chat open. If you raise your hand, I can turn on your talk. Yeah, we thank you guys. And we have about 15 minutes for question. Everybody welcome questions. I can start one while we are waiting for somebody come with question. Gus, thank you, very good talk. There's two FDA approved product, phase 3 trial, randomized controlled. One is that you mentioned the Marinol, which is Delta 9 THC, approved for appetite stimulation in AIDS patient. That's FDA approved. Another one that's approved is cannabidiol CBD for epilepsy. So that's two FDA approved drug. Can CBD also work for appetite stimulation?
So if you look at, so a lot of the claims that are made by people, not doctors, but just regular people about CBD are based on its side effects. So if you look at the side effects, the side effects are somnolence, and sedation, so that's used to treat insomnia. When the side effect is somnolence, then people use it to treat insomnia. Sedation, that's used to treat anxiety. Then people use it to treat anxiety. It's an appetite suppressant. So THC is the Marinol, which is THC, that's appetite stimulant. CBD counteracts the effects of THC, and CBD typically suppresses appetite.
I see. How about the other way around? Can THC help to treat epilepsy?
So, there are claims that the whole spectrum hemp extract, so kind of Epidiolex is pure CBD. And even though people have access to Epidiolex, so it's covered by insurance, they still prefer the CBD that they can get in dispensaries. And the deal is the CBD that people can get in dispensaries is not derived from crystallized CBD, but it's actually full spectrum hemp extract. And it has some THC, but it also has some other components. And there is a notion that there is a so-called entourage effect. So there are synergistic interactions between CBD and THC and maybe other components like terpenes present in the cannabis plant, where people are getting more benefit by the actual plant-derived material than they're getting from these pure substances. So I was involved in this clinical trial, the one that's funded by R01 AT 010381. That's a clinical trial that was going on in anesthesiology. They were looking at pain treatment in patients with osteoarthritis. And what they were looking at was a combination of Marinol and Epidiolex. So that combination, where you combine one and the other, okay, that combination, the effects is no, okay? So we were beginning to do those clinical studies where we're combining THC and CBD, but these are in fixed doses, okay? And the thing is that when you administer in fixed dose, so you may get lucky, right? You may hit the right dose, but when you administer in fixed doses, then you don't get the advantage that you're offering patients when you're allowing them to titrate, right? This is why they always prefer the dispensaries, because they will go to a dispensary and they can get CBD, which they can titrate, and independently they can get the THC, which they can also titrate, and they can then combine them both at an optimal dose, and that they cannot get from any doctor. the current medical situation does not allow doctors to recommend these medications in doses that you can self-titrate. Now, the reason why you can self-titrate cannabis is because it's non-lethal. So you're not risking patients dying. I mean, that's the interesting about cannabis. Most medications that are FDA approved and prescribed by doctors are potentially lethal. So you cannot ask patients to self-titrate because then they can kill themselves, and then you have a big liability problem. But in the case of cannabis, that's not such a big issue because there's no risk of dying. So that's why ultimately they end up preferring the substances that are in dispensaries, even though they're not FDA approved.
So anyone remain on the call? Anyone have a question? I turn on your speaker. You can talk. If you have a question, please go ahead, ask.
Hi, Gus. This is Amit Pai. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah. So thanks very much for a really interesting presentation. The question I have for you is like for a state like Michigan, where we potentially have a high use of marijuana in our young population, as we're trying to design healthy volunteer phase 1 type studies, are there any guidances on what we should be doing to sort of, whether it's required to measure for these kinds of things? Are there any risks for drug-drug interactions that we should be looking for?
So in the case of Epidiolex was specifically developed for children. So this is CBD. And my understanding is that if you have if you have a case of epilepsy in children or in adolescents, a neurologist will be more than able to recommend you what you should do with cannabis. I mean, the people in the epilepsy field, when you actually speak with the doctors who see these patients, they're very familiar with what's going on, and they are the ones that are really on top of things because they're dealing with these patients. It's not like the patient just goes off and then has no problems. No, I mean, the patient has a condition and they're getting medication, but they're probably also exploring cannabis use. The neurologist is more than equipped to give health advice to children and to adolescents. Obviously, if you're a healthy child and a healthy adolescent and a healthy adult, you don't need to be taking medication, right? I mean, I personally avoid all kinds of medication, aspirin, Tylenol. I mean, if you're healthy, you shouldn't be, you shouldn't need any form of substance. People will consume alcohol. Children will consume alcohol illegally, and they shouldn't be doing that. Cannabis is only, it's only even recreational, adult non-medical use. It's only for adults. So I would not recommend any child or adolescent to use any cannabis unless it's actually recommended by a medical doctor. And in those cases where there are real reasons to recommend, for children, the doctors are more than equipped to make that recommendation. So those doctors are really the ones that are on top of, those are the doctors that are really knowledgeable. I would just ask them, beginning with the pediatrician, but the neurologists certainly are well equipped to recommend, what to do with a child or an adolescent. I know this from speaking with patients.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much. Thank you everybody to attending the seminar. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Lucien. Thank you,
Have a
everybody.
good weekend.
Yep, you too. Bye.
Bye.